DC's new Crisis on Infinite Earths movie was planned even before the Arrowverse's crossover event. The Justice League, A Crisis on Infinite Earths. Part 1 creative team reveals the film was being worked on before the Arrowverse event. Crisis on Infinite Earths did not look at the Arrowverse version for inspiration and stuck with the original source material. The Tomorrowverse is tackling the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline relatively early in the heroes' lives, different from the Arrowverse's iteration. The role of the crime syndicate of America is unique to the Tomorrowverse, as they were not involved in the Arrowverse's version of the storyline. While Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1 was released only recently, it turns out the DC trilogy finale had been worked on prior to the Arrowverse crossover event, as the DCU movie timeline came to an end in 2023. Another DC franchise is concluding its run this year, ahead of James Gunn's DC Universe coming to life. Man of Tomorrow, the so-called Tomorrowverse, is finishing its run with the Justice League. Crisis on Infinite Earths trilogy with parts 2 and 3 on their way. Crisis on Infinite Earths. Part 1 is now out. It comes only a few years after the Arrowverse adaptation that ran between December 2019 and January 2020. However, the animated feature was already in the works before the CW's incarnation. In an exclusive Screen Rant interview, executive producer Butch and producer Jim Krieg were asked if they had looked at the Arrowverse version of Crisis on Infinite Earths, as there were parallels in Justice League. Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1. They shared the following. We didn't, at the time, we already were figuring out that we were going to do Crisis before they even were filming anything on their Crisis. I didn't look at anything. I know Jim probably didn't watch anything on that to influence them. We just went more on the basis of the George Perez and Marv Wolfman version. We stuck with that pretty much visually and story-wise. If we were going to do television with 13 episodes of this, we might go that way more because you could do more characterization. But because we had to be linear with 3 films, you had to pick and choose where you needed to go with this. My friend Eric Carrasco, who's written for us before, had gotten a job on Supergirl, and he contacted me and said, "You know they're doing Crisis," because he knew we were already building up our Crisis world. And there's an element of, oh yay, because part of it takes so long to do animation that we announced Crisis a couple of years after they've done it in the live action. And they go, "Oh, I can't believe they're doing Crisis again." And you're like, we didn't know that they were going to do Crisis, so we did avoid looking at it because we didn't want to do the same thing. We didn't want to make the mistake of just arbitrarily doing something completely different so that it stands out. We just follow the book and the themes as closely as possible. If there are things similar in the Arrowverse version as basically like ours, it's mainly because they're following the same source material anyway. Plus, with Crisis on Infinite Earths being as big as it is, the Arrowverse and Justice League. Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1 had different ways of going about it in terms of setup and in the Arrowverse, the franchise first planted the seed for the enormous storyline in the Flash pilot back in 2014. It wasn't until the events of the Elseworlds crossover in 2018 that the road toward Crisis on Infinite Earths began. The Tomorrowverse is tackling Crisis on Infinite Earths relatively early in these heroes' lives, taking place only a few years after the events of Superman, Man of Tomorrow, and the other film. The Arrowverse incarnation happened nearly a decade after Greg Berlanti's DC TV shows were launched on the CW in 2012. Another huge difference is the role that the crime syndicate of America plays in Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1, as they were not involved with the Arrowverse's iteration of the storyline. Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2 and Justice League. Crisis on Infinite Earths, the Part 3 have been released. It will be easier to tell what other differences there are between the Tomorrowverse's adaptation of the storyline in comparison to the Arrowverse. Needless to say, it will definitely be interesting to see how the Tomorrowverse ends with the remaining sequels. Hopefully, the dates for Justice League, Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2, and Justice League, Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 3 will be revealed sooner rather than later.